3 months before she died, Margaret Cole called her doctor and asked one question. Not, "How long do I have?" She already knew that. She asked, "What can I still do?" The doctor paused. She was used to that question going the other way, patients asking what could be done for them, not patients asking what they could still do for others. Margaret was 53 years old, stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The kind the doctors describe with careful language and careful eyes, because they've learned that the word terminal lands differently in a room, depending on who's sitting across from you. Margaret sat across from Dr. Susan Holt in that small office and received her sentence with a stillness that Dr. Holt would describe later to anyone who asked as the most composed response to devastating news she had witnessed in 22 years of practice. Then Margaret went home. Not to cry, not to call family. She went home, sat at her kitchen table in the house she had lived in alone for 11 years, and opened a notebook. She wrote 2 words at the top of the first page. Birchwood. Enough time? Birchwood was the small town she had lived in for 30 years. The town that had, in its quiet, persistent way, decided a long time ago that Margaret Cole didn't quite fit, didn't quite belong, wasn't quite one of them. What Margaret wrote in that notebook over the next 3 days would, by the time she died, change Birchwood completely. And the town would only find out what she had done after she was already gone. Stay with me. This one matters. You're here watching this, and I see you. If you haven't subscribed yet, it's free, and it takes 2 seconds. Drop a comment right now telling me where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely want to know. Now, let's get into Margaret's story. Margaret Cole had moved to Birchwood at 23, following a man named Robert, who had grown up there and swore it was the kind of place worth putting roots in. Robert had been right about Birchwood. He had been wrong about himself. He stayed 4 years, decided he wasn't a small-town man after all, and left for the city with someone else's name in his phone and Margaret's savings in his wallet. Margaret had no family to go back to. Her parents were gone. She was an only child, and the apartment she and Robert had shared was in his name. So she stayed in Birchwood, not because she loved it, not because it had offered her anything particularly warm, but because it was where she was, and Margaret was the kind of woman who worked with what was in front of her rather than spending energy mourning what wasn't. She got a job at the public library, then a second job, evenings at the pharmacy on Main Street. She rented a small house on the eastern edge of town, the quiet end, the end that didn't get repainted when the council organized the Main Street beautification project, the end where the streetlight had been broken for a year and a half before anyone filed a complaint. Birchwood was not a cruel town. It was something slightly harder to name than cruel. It was a town that had decided its social geography a long time ago, its preferred families, its established circles, its known stories, and it received newcomers with a politeness that never quite became warmth. Margaret had never quite cracked it. She had tried in her early years. She had volunteered at the school fair. She had joined the community gardening committee for 2 seasons before quietly stopping attending because she consistently left meetings feeling like a guest who had overstayed. She had brought food to the church harvest drive for 7 straight years and had never once been asked to join the organizing team. She was not disliked. She was simply not seen. It is its own particular kind of loneliness to live in a community for 30 years and remain peripheral, to know the names of everyone's children and have none of them know yours. But Margaret had built a life anyway, the way a practical person builds a life when the materials available are not ideal. She had her garden. She had her books. She had a small network of people she genuinely cared for, the elderly Mr. Henderson 3 doors down, who she checked on every Tuesday, the library's young assistant Katie, who was the closest thing Margaret had to a friend, and a woman at her church named Diane, who had never quite accepted Birchwood's verdict on Margaret and called her every week without fail. That was her world when the diagnosis came. Not small, but quiet, contained, unglamorous, and entirely, completely her own. Now the antagonists, because this story has them, though not the dramatic kind. the most common kind. The town council of Birchwood was led by a man named Frank Alderman, 60 years old, lifelong Birchwood resident, third generation. Frank was not a bad man in the way that would make a good villain. He was a small man in the way that makes a persistent obstacle, someone who cared intensely about how things had always been done and felt genuine discomfort when anyone proposed doing them differently. Frank had been chairman of the council for 9 years. In that time, Birchwood had received 2 separate grant opportunities for infrastructure improvements, a new well filtration system for the Eastern District, and a community health clinic, both of which had lapsed unfunded because Frank found the application process complicated and the benefits insufficiently urgent. The Eastern District, where Margaret lived, had been drinking water with elevated rust levels for 4 years. The community had no health clinic within 15 miles. Frank knew this. He had been told this at multiple meetings by multiple people. He had responded each time with variations on, "We're looking into it, and the timing isn't right, and let's not rush into anything." Frank did not dislike Margaret specifically. He simply didn't think about her at all, which amounted to the same thing in practice. There was also a woman named Patricia Webb, town social chairwoman, organizer of every community event worth attending, a person whose opinion about who belonged and who didn't had the particular weight of someone who never says anything directly, but whose preferences are perfectly understood by everyone in the room. Patricia had been the primary reason Margaret stopped attending the community gardening committee, not through confrontation, through the accumulated weight of conversations that paused when Margaret entered, invitations that extended to everyone around her and not to her, the specific architecture of a social circle that was shaped to exclude without ever naming the exclusion. Again, not evil, just small. And in a small town, small can do a great deal of quiet damage over 30 years. Margaret knew both of them well. She harbored no particular bitterness toward either. She simply had a notebook, 3 months, and a plan. The first page of Margaret's notebook, after those 2 words at the top, became a list. She spent 3 days writing it. She drew from 30 years of paying attention, 30 years of being peripheral but present, of being overlooked but not blind, of sitting in the back of meetings and the edges of gatherings and accumulating, quietly and without agenda, a detailed understanding of what Birchwood needed and why it kept not getting it. The list had 11 items. Some were large, some were small. All of them were real. She sat with the list and crossed off the ones she couldn't accomplish in 3 months with the resources available to her. Then she looked at what remained. 6 items. She wrote at the bottom of the page in her careful handwriting, 6 is enough. If 6 is all I get, 6 is enough. She started with the water. The filtration problem in the Eastern District wasn't a mystery. The technology existed. The installation wasn't complicated. The barrier was purely financial and bureaucratic. The council hadn't applied for the available grant. The deadline for the current funding cycle was 8 weeks away, and nobody had the time or the inclination to compile the application. Margaret had the time. She had nothing but time, and she intended to use every hour of it. She requested the grant documentation from the county office, drove the 40 minutes each way to pick it up, because she didn't trust it to arrive by post in the time she had. She spread the documents across her kitchen table and began reading. It took her a week to fully understand the requirements. She was not a grant writer. She had never done this before. But Margaret was a librarian by training, which meant she was, at her core, someone who knew how to research what she didn't know and learn it methodically until she understood it well enough to use it. She drafted the application in longhand first, then typed it at the library on her breaks. She called the county grant office with questions, polite, specific, prepared questions that the coordinator on the other end later said were among the most informed she'd received from a community applicant. She did not tell anyone in Birchwood what she was doing. She submitted the application on a Thursday morning, 7 weeks before the deadline, with documentation so thorough and well organized that the county coordinator called the library to ask if Margaret had professional grant writing experience. No, Margaret said. I just had time. The application was flagged for priority review. She moved to the next item on the list. The community health clinic had been a twice-raised, twice-tabled issue for 6 years. The barrier here wasn't just financial, it was logistical. The county had a mobile clinic program, a van that visited underserved communities on a rotating schedule, but Birchwood had never formally registered as a qualifying community because nobody had submitted the required documentation demonstrating need. The documentation required was specific: a community health assessment, signed testimonials from residents about access difficulties, and a letter of support from a local government representative. Margaret spent 2 weeks gathering testimonials. She went door to door on her good days. On her harder days, she called people on the phone. She knocked on doors she had never knocked on before, introduced herself to people she had lived near for a decade without properly meeting, and asked them a simple question. Have you or anyone in your family had difficulty accessing medical care because of the distance to the nearest clinic? Almost every person said yes. Several of them cried while telling her why. A young mother named Claire told Margaret about driving 40 minutes in labor because there was no closer option. An elderly man named George told her about missing 3 months of follow-up appointments for his heart condition because he couldn't drive and the bus didn't run on clinic days. A teenage girl, whose name Margaret recorded as Emma, told her about a chest infection that had gone untreated for 2 weeks because her parents couldn't take time off work to make the drive. Margaret wrote down every word. She organized the testimonials. She compiled the health assessment from publicly available county data, something she did at the library after hours, staying until 8, 9, sometimes 10 at night when her energy allowed it. The letter of support from a local government representative was the piece she wasn't sure about. She needed Frank Alderman's signature. She made an appointment. Frank was, as she had expected, not immediately enthusiastic. He received her in his small council office on a Wednesday afternoon and looked at her documents with the expression of a man who is looking at something he doesn't want to be responsible for, but also can't immediately find a reason to refuse. This is a lot of work you've done here, Margaret, he said, which was the Birchwood way of saying, why did you do this? The community needs it, she said simply. We've discussed the clinic before, and the timing. Frank. Margaret's voice was quiet, but it stopped him. I'm dying. He looked up. Stage 4 cancer. I have about 2 months left, possibly 3, and I need to know that I've used them for something that matters. I need your signature. I need it today, if that's possible. Frank looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. I didn't know, he said. Most people don't, she said. I haven't announced it, but I'm telling you now, because I want you to understand that I'm not here because I have nothing better to do. I'm here because this is the most important thing I can do with the time I have left. So please. She pushed the letter across the desk. Sign it. Frank Alderman picked up his pen. He signed it. He also, to his credit, asked, Is there anything else on that list of yours? Margaret looked at him steadily. There are 4 more items, she said. He pushed a legal pad across the desk. Tell me about them. You're halfway through this story, and something tells me you're not going anywhere. Good. If you're not subscribed yet, free, 2 seconds, do it. And drop your location in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Now, back to Margaret. Birchwood didn't know any of this was happening. That was the remarkable thing. Margaret had been part of this community for 30 years, peripheral, overlooked, present, and she moved through her last 2 months the same way she had moved through all the others, quietly, without announcement, without performance. She still came to work at the library on her good days, though there were fewer of them as the weeks passed. She still waved to the neighbors she knew. She still checked on Mr. Henderson every Tuesday. Nobody noticed she was thinner, or if they noticed, they didn't ask. Nobody noticed the late nights she spent at the library working on documents, or if they noticed the light on, they assumed she had forgotten to turn it off. Nobody noticed that she was systematically, methodically using the last of her strength and savings to address 6 problems that Birchwood had been sitting with for years. The 5th item on her list was the school. Birchwood's primary school had a resource room, a space originally intended for children with learning difficulties, to receive support that had been unstaffed for 2 years after a budget cut. 23 children with identified support needs were currently receiving minimal help from an already overextended teaching staff. Margaret had sat with this one for a while. She couldn't staff the room herself. She couldn't reverse a budget cut. But she knew something about the school's situation that the council didn't, because Margaret had spent 6 years volunteering as a reading support helper, quietly, on Thursday afternoons, in a capacity nobody had formally acknowledged or stopped. She knew the teachers, she knew the children, and she knew that there was a national education charity that provided trained volunteer coordinators to schools demonstrating specific eligibility criteria. She compiled the eligibility case. She made the calls. She attended a video conference on her laptop in her bedroom on a day she was too tired to leave the house, held the camera steady with both hands, and made the case for Birchwood Primary with the same methodical precision she had applied to every other item on her list. The charity approved the placement. A coordinator would begin in the new school year. The school's principal, a kind woman named Mrs. Lorna Davis, received the letter 6 weeks later. She called the charity to thank them and ask how the application had been processed. A community volunteer named Margaret Cole submitted it, the charity told her. Mrs. Davis didn't know who Margaret Cole was. That, in miniature, was the story of Margaret's entire life in Birchwood. The 6th item was the hardest. Not logistically. Logistically, it was the simplest thing on the list. A small wooden bridge on the east side path that connected the residential end of town to the Riverwalk, a path used every single day by elderly residents, children. Dog walkers had a broken section that had been cordoned off with cones for 8 months. The council had assigned it a repair priority rating of low because it wasn't a main road and nobody had formally complained. Margaret had twisted her ankle on the damaged section 6 months before her diagnosis. She hadn't said anything because she had learned, over 30 years, that saying things to Birchwood's official channels produced approximately nothing. She found a local contractor named Dave who quoted her a fair price. She paid it from her savings. She arranged the repair for a Saturday morning when she knew she would be well enough to watch. She sat on a folding chair at the end of the path with a cup of tea and watched Dave and his assistant fix the bridge in 3 hours. When they finished, Dave looked at her. "Who should I invoice?" he said. "I need a name for the record." "Margaret Cole," she said. "And are you the council?" he asked, because he was used to council work. "No," she said. "I'm just someone who lives here." She walked home slowly, carefully, along the fixed path. It was a cold morning, and the river was gray, and the trees were bare, and Margaret walked with her hands in her coat pockets, and the particular peace of a person who has done what they set out to do. She had 2 items left on the list. She wasn't sure she had the energy for both of them. She sat down that evening and crossed one off. Not because it wasn't important, because she was honest with herself about what her body had left. And Margaret Cole had always been honest. She had 1 month left if the doctor's estimate was right. One more thing to do. The 7th item on Margaret's original list, the one she'd crossed off in the revision process, had been about Patricia Webb and the Community Gardening Committee and the social geography of Birchwood that kept its edges cold. She had crossed it off not because she didn't think it mattered, but because she had decided she couldn't fix how a place treated people. That was too large and too human for a grant application or a contractor or a letter of support. What she could do was leave something behind. She spent her last good weeks writing. Not a letter, not a memoir. A practical document, a community guide. Everything she had learned in 30 years of being peripheral but present. Every gap she had identified. Every resource she had found. Every contact she had made. Every process she had navigated. A document that said, in essence, Here is what this town needs. Here is how to get it. Here is who to call. Here is what to say. She wrote it at her kitchen table in the evenings, a cup of tea beside her, the house quiet around her. She titled it simply, For Birchwood, from Margaret Cole. She made 3 copies. She sealed them in envelopes addressed to Frank Alderman, Mrs. Davis at the school, and Katie at the library. She asked Diane to deliver them after she was gone. Then she called Dr. Holt and told her she was ready for hospice care. Margaret died on a Tuesday in February, quietly, in her own house, with Diane holding one hand and Katie holding the other, because these 2 women had been there at the end, in the way that people are there when someone has made themselves matter to them quietly and completely over years. Mr. Henderson came. He sat in the hallway because he couldn't manage the stairs, but he came. The funeral was modest. Diane organized it. It was held at the church Margaret had attended for 27 years. The church where she had sat in the 3rd row from the back without ever being asked to join anything. 43 people came. Not a large number for someone who had lived in a town for 30 years. But the 43 people who came were the people Margaret had actually touched, the neighbors she had checked on, the library regulars she had helped, the mothers whose children she had quietly assisted on Thursday afternoons, the elderly residents whose medical testimonials she had recorded, the contractor Dave who had fixed the bridge and had somehow felt, by the end of that morning, that he understood something important about this woman without being able to say what. Patricia Webb came. She sat near the back, and she looked, for the first time in Diane's memory of her, uncertain. Frank Alderman came. He sat near the front. He had a piece of paper in his jacket pocket, a letter he'd received from the county 3 days before Margaret died. The water filtration grant had been approved. He had been trying to figure out how to tell her. He hadn't made it in time. Diane delivered the envelopes 2 days after the funeral. Frank read his at his desk. He read it straight through, 27 pages of clear, organized, thoroughly documented community need, and then he sat with it for a long time before he made any phone calls. The first call he made was to the county grant office to ask about the mobile clinic application Margaret had submitted. It was in the final stage of review. It would be approved within the month. The second call was to the school, to Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis read her envelope that evening. Then she called the library and asked if Katie had read hers. "I'm reading it right now," Katie said. "Did you know she submitted the charity application for the resource room coordinator? The placement was already approved. She did it 2 months ago." A silence. "I didn't know that," Mrs. Davis said. "None of us knew," Katie said. What happened next in Birchwood was not dramatic. Real things rarely are. Frank called a council meeting. He stood at the front of the room and told the council what Margaret Cole had done in the last months of her life. The grant applications, the documentation, the testimonials, the bridge, the school. He read sections of her guide aloud. He did not editorialize. He just reported what she had done and let the room sit with it. The room was quiet for a long time after he finished. A council member named Stephen, who had lived 3 streets from Margaret for 8 years, said, "I didn't know her." "Neither did I," Frank said. "Not really, and she saved this town more in 3 months than this council has in 3 years." Nobody argued. Patricia Webb, who was not on the council but had been invited as community chair, sat in the back of that meeting room in the same chair she had occupied in every meeting she'd ever attended in Birchwood, and felt something shift in her chest that she later described to her husband as realizing, "You've been looking at something wrong for a very long time." She went home and made a list of her own that night. It wasn't as long as Margaret's, but it was a beginning. The water filtration approval arrived 6 weeks after Margaret died. The mobile clinic began its Birchwood rotation 10 weeks after that. The first time it came to the east side of town, a line formed down the street: elderly residents, young families, people who had been managing without adequate access to health care for years. A woman named Claire, the young mother who had told Margaret about driving in labor, brought her daughter to the clinic for her 2-year checkup. It was the first checkup the child had received at the proper time, without a 40-minute drive each way. Claire didn't know, as she waited in line, that the clinic was there because of Margaret. She learned later, through the series of conversations that started spreading through Birchwood once people read the guide and started connecting the dots. The guide itself had a quiet, viral life in Birchwood. Diane made copies. Katie put one in the library. Frank referenced it in council meetings. People passed it around. People read it and recognized, line by line, need they had felt but never articulated so clearly, help they had accepted without knowing where it had come from. The resource room coordinator started in September, the new school year. The first week she was there, 23 children received tailored support they had not had access to for 2 years. Mrs. Davis stood in the doorway on the first morning and watched and felt the specific, overwhelming emotion of someone who has seen a gap closed that they had gotten used to living with. She thought about Margaret Cole. She thought about how she hadn't known her name before the funeral. She thought about a woman who had spent Thursday afternoons in this building for 6 years without anyone ever properly thanking her. She thought about this for a long time. Still with me, good. If you haven't liked this video yet, do it now. Subscribe if you haven't. And drop in the comments where you're watching from. I want to build a picture of who's in this community. Now the final part of Margaret's story.